الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. You're listening to the Voice of Islam radio show. I'm your host, Umar, joined with my co-host, Usman. Usman, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Amragan. May peace be upon you as well. To all of our listeners, welcome to our show. You are listening to the Voice of Islam radio, the radically engaging, spiritually stimulating show about Islam. Brought to you by Muslims who believe in the Messiah, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. We have tens of millions of Muslims for peace in over 200 countries, and we're also the organized Muslim community here in the United States. Our motto is love for all, hatred for none. For our listeners who are listening and want to learn more about Islam and its revival through the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, you can go online to trueislam.com. That's TRUEISLAM.com. And you can also check out our Facebook page, Voice of Islam Radio Show. And if you'd also like to talk to someone and ask questions directly, call the 1-866-Y-ISLAM number. Since 1889, our community has condemned all terrorism and strives without violence to establish peace and educate the world about the true teachings of Islam. You can email us your questions and comments to voiceofislamradioshow@gmail.com. My name is Usman Muzaffar, here with my co-host Armagan, and we'll be here with you for the next hour for real talk on Islam. Thank you, Armagan, for having me on another episode. How are things going?
Things are going good. You know, it's again, so far 2021 has proven to be a little bit smoother than last year. I know, a lot of the folks in the rest of the United States are still getting over this polar vortex. I know Texas was hit really hard, but in California, things are still, for the most part, sunny and peachy. What about you?
Absolutely, I would agree. There hasn't been a lack of surprises this year, I think, on any level. But it's great to see, the weather in California is nice and things are moving along. So, it's a pleasure to be on the show with you again. I think it's great to discuss these topics, especially as I've been following your episodes and your previous podcast, touching upon a lot of different issues. Very excited to have an opportunity to speak to our listeners and give them an angle on Islam.
Absolutely. And, we came out of last year, which was a very tumultuous year to say the least. And even, just 4 or 5 years before that, we started to see kind of social changes and a lot of harbingers for the future to come. And so there are a lot of pressing items that we've seen come to light, and a lot of stuff that we're still, as a society and as a culture, dealing with and kind of figuring it out. And so, with that in mind, we've got a pretty exciting topic, isn't that right, Usman?
Definitely agree. Really excited to get into today's topic, especially as it's a conversation that has really become, the forefront of recent events, and especially coming out of Black History Month, now entering March. Ideologies concerning equality are something that, are very important. And so I'm excited to discuss the topic today, which is the truth concerning racism and the idea of racial superiority. Definitely excited to get into, what the historical context of that is, the Islamic perspective, and how that can benefit other people.
Absolutely. And, having grown up here and, having the privilege of being young, from a child to an adult, we've witnessed the paradigm shift multiple times now, and it's still shifting before our eyes. And so we certainly want to make sure that we do address this topic in a nuanced way, because it's certainly not, a black and white topic. There's multiple different shades that we need to look at. And so to really help us understand and chew through this topic, we want to welcome to the show missionary Azam Akram, who is calling us live from Seattle. Is that right, missionary Akram?
Yes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm based out of Seattle, Washington.
Welcome to the show. We're very happy to have you. Now, Seattle, you were hit with the polar vortex a little bit as well. Is that right?
Yeah, we're hit with the polar vortex, a bit of fire sometimes, and we get the whole run of things. But alhamdulillah, everybody's doing well here, and we've got mild weather now, and
Good. Yeah, I've got some friends and family in Portland, and I hear that they're thawing out. So hopefully, with the rest of the nation, specifically in Seattle, especially where you guys are at, you guys are thawing out as well, and get to enjoy some of the beautiful sunshine that we're gonna have to come. But you know, with that being said, that's all fine. You know, the weather is always nice, and it's always good for us to be able to go out and enjoy the beautiful sunshine. But you know, for some people, especially in specific climates, and I don't mean weather climates. I mean in social climates, it isn't easy to go out and just enjoy the sunshine. I mean, there are people that are in marginalized groups, be it Black Americans, Hispanics, even Muslims from various nations who may have to walk around or may feel that they have to walk around this country with kind of an air of inferiority or feel like they're being looked down upon, and there are other races or other groups that feel a superiority over them. And so, you know, we wanted to address this topic and kind of get an understanding and speak about this. And so, just to get started, you know, specifically looking and speaking about these different groups that may be marginalized and maybe dealing with these issues, you know, from an Islamic perspective, we always look back to God. You know, we see God, Allah, as the creator of all things, and that includes different groups of people and you know, different tribes and what have you. And so I guess the first question I want to start off with is, you know, we see all these issues that are going on in the world, and if an atheist was to ask, well, you know, if your God created all these different people, why? Well, number one, why did he create so many different people if he knew they were going to fight amongst themselves racially? And secondly, you know, why do these people have this hate for other races and tribes in their heart? What would we say to that as Muslims?
I mean, yeah, the word Islam and the word Muslim boils down to submitting, right? Giving up your own biases and your own desires and aligning it itself with that of God. So inherently, I do feel that the value that Islam brings is number one, it pushes the reset button very early on. Number one. Number two, then it implements this new and radical shift in thinking, which tells us that we are no longer just our own independent tribes or sub-tribes. The 49th chapter of the Holy Quran is one of the most profound. And when you read it, specifically the 14th verse, God reminds us by saying that, O mankind, we have created you male and female, and we have divided you into tribes, and then further divided you into sub-tribes. Why? So that you may recognize one another. Now, God tells us that the purpose that we've been divided and created different is so that we recognize one another and we appreciate one another. But we all have to come at it in a state of submission. Because further continuing, God says, verily, the most honorable amongst you in the sight of God is the one who is most righteous. Now, he doesn't say the one who's the tallest, the one who's the fair skin, the one who is this or that. God has a different measure and a different standard that we shall be judged by. So, to answer your question, when we look at animals, there's an element of territorialism. There's an element of, fraternity, a wolf pack. But what Islam has done is it's come to tame that animal and turn animal into man, and then unite mankind with one human race. For those of you who speak Urdu or Persian or understand, we have the word Adami, right? The word Adami comes from the word Adam, and the end is the prefix Ya, which means my man. So we are all the children of Adam, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our race, regardless of our physical attributes or complexions. It all boils down to the conduct of our character and what's in our heart.
Missionary Akram, thank you so much for sort of breaking down at a very basic level and fundamental value of Islam that that we believe in. And so, I think that excerpt is actually very important, as it challenged many of the values of pre-Islamic Arabic society. At a time where inequalities were based on tribal membership and wealth and kinship, and for the people at that time in a historical context to hear something that is so liberating and such a catalyst for equality, I think it's very remarkable. So thank you for answering that question. And in that same light, bringing it back to sort of the modern day American society as we draw a comparison, I think a great question, Imam Akram, with your experience, would be that how does Islam provide a solution to American society today that has caused so much pain to such a large part of the population? And you can choose to break this down, socially, morally, however you'd like to start.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to sum this up in an hour or whatnot. But the fact of the matter is that history does repeat itself. The fact of the matter is that Islam did come within a framework of established slavery, right? We know that the first martyrs of Islam were martyred by their slave masters because they found the fundamental value of Islam very promising. It saw them as human beings for the first time. And I think this is what, when we look at the Ahmadiyya Muslim community here in the 1920s, right, when Mufti Sadiq Saab came, Radiyallahu anhu, the first Muslim missionary sent here for that purpose, who gravitated towards him? That's the practical value that you could take any social experiment. I think that was one of the greatest social experiments, is that there's a foreigner, completely unknown to Americans, oddly looking to everybody else, but who gravitates towards the message that he's promoting of Islam. It is the African American community. I don't know who was it, Malcolm X, who said it best, that the most segregated hour of America is that Sunday morning when everybody's in church. But when Mufti Saab said, hey, look, blacks and whites, no difference. That was very revolutionary. Blacks could have positions of office within an administration in a church or a mosque. Wow, leadership positions. So this was practiced this is not Mufti Sadiq Saab coming and inventing these principles and theories. You look at the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, right? One of the greatest individuals that we revere today, and we call him Sayyidina. Sayyidina means our master. Sayyidina Bilal, Radiyallahu anhu. And who was this individual? He was also a slave. His slave master was one of the most cruelest, and would beat him and abuse him. And you can read the annals of the accounts, but what I'm trying to explain to you is that a deen, or an institution, a religion that came 1400 years ago, where racism was prevalent, but then how did the Prophet ﷺ deal with this? I mean, we can take these examples. The Prophet ﷺ just didn't speak about, hey, look, racism is bad, we should end it. But when he fundamentally acknowledged that this is an issue and this is a problem, that was the first step, right? He said, this is wrong, and we need to fix it. We fundamentally need to shift the paradigm that we see society as, right? So if you think about it, why did the Prophet create his enemies? It wasn't because he was introducing people to God necessarily in their eyes, right? He brought something that was foundational to changing the institutions upon which they lay their systems, right? Whether it's subjugation of the slaves, treating them in any ill way. We know, for example, Abu Jahl, just out of spite, would just stab one of the early Muslim martyrs, Hazrat Sumayya, with a spear in her, her private region, just out of spite. So this was the suffering, this was the pain that they went through, number one. But they understood the value that this sacrifice would yield some results later on. So the Prophet ﷺ fundamentally understood that there was an issue. He acknowledged it first. Then he sought to change it. He sought to change it by his own practical example, right? For example, one of his wet nurses happened to be a black woman. And he told people, look, my mother happens to be black, right? Wow. Somebody saying that and acknowledging it. His adopted son, Hazrat Zaid bin Haritha, adopted son. Now, he surrounded himself with people of that type of ilk. We know he promoted interracial relationships, which is very odd for that time. So again, there are like so many practical steps. Here, interracial relationships, depending on the state you're in, were banned up until 30, 40 years ago. So for somebody to come in and try to institute those types of practices in a society that only knew racist and bigoted and biased ideas, and to transform that society in a period of 23 years, where slaves themselves became our masters, Sayyidina, we call them Bilal. And not only that, but Hazrat Osama, anhu, the son of a slave, was the first commander to lead an expedition after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And who did he lead? Great companions like Hazrat Umar, anhu, right? So it's one thing to understand that, look, we can talk about slavery, we can talk about racism, and we can talk about all these things all we want. But until we ourselves are not practically willing to do those types of things in our lives, surrounding ourselves by those types of relationships, and fundamentally showing how this is done, it's talk at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the examples you gave, and they certainly do resonate because, I mean, when you do look at the example of a pre-Islamic Arabia, and even Arabia, the Arabian people at the time when Islam was being implemented, I mean, these were people who were vehemently proud of their origins, of their family names, of their tribes, of the wealth that they had, and even the folks that weren't themselves wealthy, they still had this Arab blood that they held so superior. And so it truly is a testament of God and of history for anybody to look at and see that these are the people that basically overnight, because they didn't have multiple generations to kind of think about this and try to implement and create institutional change. They had to, in basically one generation, in the time of the Prophet, immediately kind of resolve these issues. I mean, you mentioned Hazrat Osama, and one of the most beautiful examples related to the, he led in entire coalitions. One of the beautiful examples of Hazrat Osama, who, by the way, not only is the son of a slave, but I believe was of Ethiopian descent. For more context, some of the companions of the Prophet, when it was announced that he would be leading these campaigns, they had difficulty with this. And it wasn't simply because he was a son of a slave or because he was Ethiopian. He was also decades younger. He was a child relative to their age. And they went to the Prophet of Islam and they said, "Oh Prophet, how can this kid, in essence, lead us? We have so much experience. We're noblemen. We're XYZ." And in that moment, the response of the Prophet of Islam was, listen to this young boy, this young man. For whatever he says, it is as if I'm saying it. And so imagine that agency, the leader of this entire nation, the greatest prophet, the seal of the prophets, to come and say that whatever this man says, it is my own voice that he's compelling forward. So that's a great deal of agency to really consider that this was all within basically one generation. Now, of course, it does still take time to kind of spread this ideology and spread this equality, but it still is very compelling to think about. Now, one of the things that I've been looking at recently is I've been seeing kind of a correction happen over the past few years, particularly with Disney. They're often criticized, with their early films being very, very, Anglo-Saxon oriented. They were all stories from white nations and their ideals of beauty were always of the fair skin, and to show various ways that it's in essence white people of history have lived. And so one of the things that I've seen recently in like the most recent Spider-Man movie, for example, was in the background, one of the friends of the main character is this girl wearing a hijab, and she has a minor role. She's not a main character by any means, but I was kind of jarring for me to see this, just to see this character thrown into the loop without any context. And so I guess the question is this implementation, is this the correct way of, just kind of putting minorities in the forefront and to kind of get the population to be desensitized to seeing minorities in a sense? I mean, is there a better way, a more thoughtful way that we can go about this?
Yeah, I mean, imaging and in a way, the way we present people matters, right? So, for example, in the 90s, we obviously went through a trend where all brown people were Muslim terrorists, right? And Hollywood reflected that type of imagery. And it does have an effect on the minds and the thinkings of people. Just like we are what we eat, right, in terms of our diet. We also have a media consumption that we consume that also affects our way of thinking. So, are there better ways? Absolutely, right? But is it a start and an acknowledgement? We'll give it that. But if it's like the token hijabi in the scene, then, that's not what we're after. The, the purpose of the hijab, and I want to be very serious about this, is that it is an institution, not given to us by Islam, but reinforced by Islam, right? Because according to Islam, the greatest height of spirituality for anybody, man or woman, is Hazrat Maryam, Mary, mother of Jesus. Why? Because the height of spirituality is not just for you to be spiritual and pure yourself, but you should have the capacity to replicate that, right? Without any foreign agency. You don't need any extra help. You should be able to do it yourself. And so, whether it comes to ending, bigotry, or standing up for our sisters and our daughters and our mothers' rights as Muslims, which we have to do because that's what our Prophet told us to do. So all those things, I think, if every Muslim, forget promoting Islam to other people right now, but if each and every one of us did our part, you would see those circles of changes and spheres that could bloom and blossom into amazing and healthy little communities, right? But what happens sometimes is we as Muslims, especially here, sometimes we cower because our opinions aren't very popular right now. But the fact of the matter is that the reason we are here in the United States of America is to bring morality into our social circles, right? We've looked at our leadership. I'm not going to say what it looks like, but we can all agree leadership has failed us. And you want to talk about moral bankruptcy, it's full height to be displayed to everybody. So what Islam says is, look, it comes down to every individual. Use the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as your model. Replicate that. He was a human being, so it's possible. He's not some superhuman that nobody can achieve any status to. He bled like you and I. He suffered loss and grief. He had the same 24 hours you did. He probably had less material resources than you did. But the fact of the matter is he did bring about a substantial change where today people recognize him. And the most popular name in the world today is Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam because people know the value that he added to the world. So, yeah, I mean, I've spoken on this issue many different ways, but the reality of the situation is that there has to be, we have to get uncomfortable, right? Like you and I talking, we have to get uncomfortable. And Umragan and Osman, you probably know, I used to be in the south side of Chicago before I came out here to Seattle, right? So I'm dealing with a 99.8% African American demographic. And then I'm up here in Monroe, Washington. I'm attending Trump rallies, almost every weekend. So you see that dichotomy. But one thing I will tell you, seeing both sides, sitting and eating and enjoying my time with them, when you call somebody a white supremacist and you sit down and talk to them, they don't know they're being white supremacists. They don't know any other way, right? So again, there has to be moderation in understanding these views.
Right.
So that's the thing I think Islam really brings to understand. That was the practice of the Prophet. I can give you an example of, a companion, one of the greatest companions we know, Hazrat Abu Dharr Ghafari, radhiyallahu anhu, who after the death of the Prophet ﷺ was so heartbroken that he went away to live a life because he couldn't bear the loss of the Prophet. But this one time he practically called Hazrat Bilal radhiyallahu anhu the N-word. He called him a son of a black woman. Right now, here is a companion, somebody who's accepted Islam, but he still has elements of ignorance in him. And when the Prophet found out, the Prophet was really upset. And he said that. He said, Abu Dhar, you still have traces of Jahiliyyah in you. Right? So we need to call a spade, even when we see it in our own communities, right?
And Imam Akram, for context, can you explain to us and the listeners, what does Jahiliyyah even mean? What is the meaning in context?
Yeah, so Jahiliyyah is a period of time. For example, for if you're a Christian, you'll understand the Christian Dark Ages, right? Where ignorance was at its height. And in terms of that, just prior to Islam coming in Arabia, they were in this deep ignorance called Jahiliyyah. Now, the technical term of Jahiliyyah is ignorance, and it means basically that the real definition when you go to the dictionary or the lexicon, Jahiliyyah means treating two sets of people differently for the same action or the same crime because of the social status that they belong to, right? That's a perfect example of racism right there.
Missionary Akram, thank you for shedding some realistic context for our listeners. For those of you who are just joining, you are listening to the Voice of Islam radio show. Our motto is love for all, hatred for none. We have Missionary Akram with us answering the real challenging questions about the issues that our society is facing. Missionary Akram, thank you for making a clear distinction about the realistic nature of racism. The interesting thing about discrimination and outcasting a certain group, even in the context of American history, is that segregation has never proved to be an appropriate solution. As you mentioned, examples of people, even domestically, we've seen the recent events of people storming the Capitol. We've seen threats of domestic terrorism, and we know that racism isn't in fact the root fundamental issue here. I think that there's an underlying sort of principle that's sort of guiding people to act in a certain way. Can you touch a little bit upon the cause of racism and why it's happening?
Yeah, I'm not going to touch upon it. I think the Prophet ﷺ has reminded us that he said that racism really comes from a disease of the heart. It's called pride, right? It's the pride in the heart, even and the Prophet ﷺ in the Hadith says, even if it's a tiny amount. So this is because pride means that one rejects the truth. And who was the one who fundamentally manifested that? We know Shaitan or Satan. Whether you take the historical Christian view and that allegory, or you take the Islamic point, at the end of the day, that pride, that conceit, that understanding that I am better than, is not somebody who can align itself with the Muslim understanding. Because Islam says that the greatest Muslim is the one who submits and is the most humble.
Humble, right? No arrogance.
No arrogance. So it's like two different worlds. And if you truly manifest that Islamic ideal, there's no way you can have that arrogance and pride. you would only see yourself beneath everybody else and couldn't even harbor those feelings. It's impossible.
And that's a very important, distinction to make in such a multifaceted issue where, racism, even if it were to be solved throughout different communities, we've seen examples of people being racist within their own communities. And so you see that, as you said, the root cause of it is the absence of understanding, and then the feeling of arrogance that people may have that they are superior to somebody else. And, they will always find ways to segment and separate, on the basis that they're somehow better than somebody else. So I think that's a great point that you make. And, when discussing this, it's important to understand, I think, how we can do our part, in our society, in our communities, to find an outlet to be able to create that societal and communal change. What would you recommend to people listening and people in society, in communities, to act upon the sort of unity that Islam teaches?
Well, I think we've got to look at it from our practical point of view. You're living here in the United States of America. I've walked into mosques that say, hey, I'm a Bosnian mosque, or I'm a Yemeni mosque, or Islam never really had that. So when you look at the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and this is where I think we provide this understanding, I could be talking to a Chinese Ahmadiyya Muslim, I could be talking to a Marshallese Chinese Muslim. We're in over 202 different nations all across the world. We're bridging those gaps. You look at whether it's, the fundamental pillar of Islam is the Hajj, and you look at what Malcolm X said after he returned from the Hajj. All of his racist ideologies were just chucked right out the window because he practically saw this manifested. So in 2020, you have to ask yourself, if Islam does espouse these views, right, why is it that some of the most racist countries in the world are Arab countries, right? I mean, they treat even their own darker skinned folks like so terribly. So you have to understand there is a difference between Islam that is ideal and, unfortunately, the ignorant Jahiliya Muslims that we see today. Right? Don't confuse the two. What I want people to do is have a look at the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, understand its model, and vet that model and see, is this a viable solution to knock or end racism in the world today? And ask yourself that question. If you think it is, let us know. I think we can go around it with so many different arguments in so many different ways, but at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. And if you want to vet a community in the world today, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim, just look at its followers and look what it says. Because one thing I want to end is, I don't know how much time we have. Do we have some 5 minutes?
I think we have about 10 minutes.
Okay. So there's another great companion by the name of Hazrat Juwaybir, Razillah Ta'ala anhu. He himself calls himself the ugliest and the most useless person. One day the Prophet ﷺ tells him, why don't you go get married? He says, who's going to get married to me? This is my value. But the fact that the Prophet ﷺ saw value in him and said, go and ask such and such individual for his daughter's hand in marriage. The Prophet said, he did as the Prophet said. When he knocked on the individual's door, this is a companion, a Muslim, very highly regarded by the Prophet, had trusted him to send Hazrat Juwaybir to his door to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. The Sahabi replied, hold on a second. This is not our custom. This is not the way we do things. You're of a different class. We are of a different class. Hang on. Let me go and verify with the Prophet. When the Prophet said, yes, indeed, I sent him, that was it. He gave his daughter's hand in marriage to her. So you got to have a great look. I don't know if any of you are fathers and have daughters and understand the nuances and all that stuff, but you got to have a lot of trust in somebody to be able to pull something like that. And so really it's a different paradigm shift in the way we think about each other. Um, and we've got to take the lead on these things. We've got to take the lead on these issues. If you're in your social circles and you hear something that is not tolerated, I mean, that is inexcusable, in terms of dialogue and discourse, there you shouldn't stand there and listen to that. And sometimes, look, we do it too sometimes, and unfortunately, we also have to, like those Disney movies, right? We have to vet ourselves and clean ourselves. Dr. Seuss, there's 6 books they can't print out anymore, right? Now, you can call it cancel culture or you can call it something else, but we also have to do a self-analysis and a self-reflection. Like, how many times have you heard that joke, that has this racist element or the racist tinge in it? In Pakistan and Indian subculture, we have, uh, you know, uh, Muslims making fun of Sikh folks, Hindus making fun of this and that. Those as well, Hazur has talked about that sometimes just even entertaining conversations like that can kind of lower your standard and that radar that Allah Ta'ala has put within you, that I shouldn't be talking like this, that also becomes numb. So we should be very careful with our social circles, people we hang around with. We should diversify our friends, good friends. That should be the character of the quality of the care of the individual. It should not be the color of their skin, but really good-hearted people. I think we can do that. Right?
Yeah, Imam Akram, I want to ask a little bit more detail with regards to the ideal of extinguishing the ego, and a little more context on this question. You had mentioned this earlier to the question that Osman had asked, and it brought to mind the story of Malcolm X, which is a very practical example for many, many people. I mean, Malcolm X was coming not only from a era of extreme oppression, but he also had a viewpoint of fighting eye for an eye and to really come up by any means necessary, and he believed this in his heart. And it wasn't until he went to Hajj, which he did the pilgrimage to Arabia, to the holy house of God, the Kaaba, where he goes and he observes all of these different Muslims from different backgrounds, different colors, different even levels of wealth and social class, social character. And he sees all these Muslims not only walking side by side around this Kaaba. There's no segregation there. But in addition to that, he sees that to the left and to the right is these different races praying together. And the way he put it was such a beautiful and poetic way. And I don't know the exact quote, so I don't want to butcher it. But
Can
just
I
that
do the
concept,
exact quote?
if you can, please.
Yeah, he says there were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, but we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between white and the non-white. You may be shocked by these words coming from me, but on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held, and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. This was not too difficult for me, despite my firm convictions. I have always been a man who tries to face facts and to accept reality of life as new experiences and new knowledge unfolds it. I have always kept an open mind, which is necessary to the flexibility that must go hand in hand with every form of intelligent search for truth. During my past 11 days here in this Muslim world, I have eaten from the same plate, drunk from the same glass, and slept in the same bed or on the same rug while praying to the same God with my fellow Muslims, whose eyes were the bluest of the blue, whose hair was the blondest of the blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of the white. And in the words and in the actions and in the deeds of the white Muslims, I felt the same sincerity that I felt amongst the black African Muslims of Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana. We are truly all the same brothers. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the world.
Yeah, I mean, even hearing those words, when you think of ego, it seems like such a heavy weight to hold on to. I mean, even in the most arbitrary of disagreements, it's so difficult to stop being angry, and to try to deal with, your emotions at that moment. But hearing Missionary Akram, recite those words of Malcolm X, it almost seems like poetry. It just kind of light as a feather, brush off, and really elaborate this ideal of letting the ego go and moving forward in love and harmony. I mean, if you look at the context of Malcolm X, he was coming from basically a war zone. I mean, literally, not basically, literally a war zone. And it almost seems like he walked into this beautiful garden of love and unity in the cause of Allah. And so Imam Akram, on this topic of the ego, for the listeners, how can we elaborate what happened to Malcolm X at Hajj? What did he witness and feel that made him change his viewpoint so dramatically and find a new path in life from that moment on?
I think he says it himself here, which is the fact that he was overwhelmed. The Quran talks about the fact that one of the key attributes of a believer is kunu ma sadiqeen, is that they hang around like-minded folks. And so there's always this element and this tinge of spirituality that exudes skin color and whatnot. And I think that's what he saw really at the end of the day. It was real, it was raw, it was emotional, it was spiritual. It was beyond anything words could transcend. He tried to pen it in a letter. But I would like to say, though, Osama, you said love for all, hatred for none. It's our motto. But this is also a motto that's very interesting, because after Malcolm X had gone through his tour of Africa in 1964, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Salis, the third Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and this is actually a sermon that's recorded. It's called The Message of Love and Brotherhood to Africa. He also did a tour of 6 African nations in 1970. But he didn't just stop there. What he did was, Africa was coming out of this post-colonial era, but Hazur, the founder, the Khalifa of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, wanted to invest in the African community. And if you read this sermon, Hazur talks about the fact that, despite the prejudice that exists in the Indian subculture of how blacks may be dirty and, blacks may be uncivilized, Hazur says that they are much cleaner than you. They are pure. They are clean-hearted. They are more hygienic. I mean, just the way the Jamaat understood how to invest in the infrastructure in Africa today, where, for example, the country of Ghana had taken the Ahmadiyya Muslim community structure for the schools and had nationalized it into their structure. The government appreciated the hospitals. So fundamentally, when we saw that, Africa had a chance to be exploited and is being exploited in a negative way, there's so much talent. There's so much resources that are raw. And so we are very active and also very busy in spreading the message of Islam and Ahmadiyyat there, but also investing in those communities so that maybe one day they may be able to lead the world. Because according to our Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmad, our 5th and current Khalifa, Hazur has reiterated the fact that if Africa got united, it has the capacity to lead the world. So we are very, excited, number one. And hopefully these changes that we're seeing in America are just a sliver of the changes that inshallah will be taking place in the future. But with the background of Islam as a message to guide these changes, I think we can expect, if we do implement this through the Islamic way, we can expect similar results, which are revolutionary changes in the fabric of our communities and the social structures.
It's very profound. It's very powerful, the effect of the unity that Islam brings between people and the submission to one higher power that sort of puts everybody on an equal playing field. And I think, that's really important for people to understand, where Islam might seem like this foreign ideology, but there have been, racial thinkers and leaders such as Malcolm X, in the context of American history, who have found peace and who have established a resolution for these ideas through the ideals of Islam. And I think at times in the world, when people hear about our religion and see sort of the turmoil going on in countries that have adopted it, it's important for them to understand to stick to the ideology rather than the people, like you mentioned earlier, the Jahil people that are putting Islam in a negative light. I think it's important in a world where there's so much racial tension and violence roiling contemporary America that what can we rely on? Can we rely on our institutions that are morally bankrupt and we've seen have special interests? Can we rely on other systems to essentially establish peace for ourselves and for other people? I think Islam's ideology is not so far off in the lines of logic and psychology and just overall logic. So I think it's great that you mentioned that.
Yeah, I want to reiterate, and Armagan has heard me say this before, and sometimes I get a lot of flack, but Islam really has not brought anything revolutionary in terms of what the world didn't already know. Allah Ta'ala says Islam is revealed according to the fitrah, the nature of man. So when you say, hey man, it makes sense, yeah, it's Islamic. That's why. So some people also, that's the other problem we run in. Well, Islam has copied, these teachings. Yeah, it made sense. That's why we copied it. It works. It's good. Why not copy something good, right? And we're not ashamed of that. Don't eat pork. We didn't come up with that. That's a great idea. Just don't eat it. Alcohol, it's called an abomination. All right. If the Bible says so, we'll follow the words of Jesus Christ because he provides value to us. So all these things that we talk about, say prayer, for example, people are praying prior to Islam. Islam just said, hey, look, here's 5 times, make it consistent, and you'll develop a level of discipline in your life, which would be so profound that. So I'll be honest with you, as a Muslim, when you pray 5 times a day, you have a very different attitude to you. It shows up in your style of speaking. It shows up in your gaze. It shows up in your walk. It shows up in, everything. And, when you're not praying 5 times a day, that your stride is not the same. You get what I'm saying? And this is proven too, like, for example, people who watch a lot of indecent things online and things like that, their attitude also when they are presented outside or in their social circles, they tend to have certain presentations about themselves that kind of give away certain things. They're not as confident, they're not as, it's there. So what I wanted to make everybody appreciate and understand is that our Khalifa, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, understands, and the Quran, this is from the Quran, whether you're a Jew or you're a Christian or you're a Muslim, the fundamental value is that we must all believe in Allah and the last day and work towards being good people. Work towards that united front and the united goal, which is, at the end of the day, we're not each other's enemies. We're not here to create gangs, because you think about it, gang mentality is very animalistic, right? Fraternities, gangs, and tribes. Islam has come to elevate that. We are to go beyond that and start to look at life in a very cerebral way rather than a very limited way. The world is not limited. There's so much bounty. God is full of mercy. So nobody's going to come for your pie. The pie is too big and you're going to get your share. Don't worry about it. That's the mentality. And if you have that humility about it, that we're going to come at it, we want to be humble, we want to appreciate each other. Trust me, life is so much more easier and it's so much more fulfilling. And you are in control of your own happiness. But when you think about the fact that your way of life, and this is what I mean when I talk about a lot of white supremacists, they're not really white supremacists. They just are afraid of their way of life changing because they've been sold this idea that, hey, look, they're coming after whatever it is, right? Your jobs or your girls or this or that. It's scary. And Shaitan uses those tools again of survival, trying to keep this race pure and all that stuff. At the end of the day, look, the browning of America is happening, and you're brown, I'm brown, but they say by 2060, the majority of Americans will be brown color, right? So again, we have to come to terms with that reality. And it's nothing racist. It's just what it is. Civilizations come, civilizations go. The Quran has spoken about that, and we learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, very beautifully said. And I think the only summation, the only way to kind of just cap that off is just the idea of Allah Akbar. You know, when you are, not you, but when an individual feels this air of superiority, racial superiority, or you know, class superiority, whatever it is, you're in that essence saying, I am great. But Islam, like we said, kills that ego. It diminishes it. Because when you say Allah Akbar, you're not just saying that God is great, but you're saying that God is greater. And so anything that you hold dear or high or valuable, be it your own life, your own wealth, even your own family, when you say Allah Akbar as a Muslim, you are saying in this moment and forever after, Allah is greater. And so when you hold that idea, there is almost no way to maintain that while still believing in this ideal of Allah is greater. That being said, we're right at time. Missionary Akram, we thank you so very much for coming onto the show, dialing in. We know you're states away, but we've had you on before, and we hope to have you on again because you always leave us with wonderful wisdom.
I really appreciate the time, and it also allows me to share whatever little experience I have. But I'll tell you one thing. It's all about the greatest weapon that we have is prayers. So when people are watching these shows and these episodes, I really think it's about looking at ourselves introspectively, because at the end of the day, that's what Islam reminds you of, right? Is that your world is just limited within what you can control. It sounds terrible, but you can't control 90% of the stuff that happens in your life. You can't. You know, but what you can control is your reaction, which is about 10% of the stuff that happens you can react to well. But Islam focuses on that 10%. What is your reaction? And if you can, it doesn't sound like a good investment, but neither does GameStop, but who knows, right? But the fact of the matter is, invest in that 10%, which is you and your reaction to the situations that happen in the world, and you'll be golden, right? People are worried about the 90%, which they can't really control, but it is a large chunk. It makes sense to try to control, but it'll never change. You can't control anybody except yourself. The sooner we realize that, the better off we'll be.
Absolutely. And there's no better way to end the show with those wonderful words. To all of our listeners, we'll see you again next week at the exact same time, 2 p.m. Until then, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.
الله أكبر
Wa alaikum salam. Assalamu alaikum.